So I thought of doing an Odyssey video, just a little quick one, because I have a lot of thoughts on it, and there's a lot of discourse on it, and I thought it might be kind of fun to do. Um, so I was reading Bernard Williams a while ago, his book *Shame and Necessity*. And he has this line I thought was really good. He says, "To make the ancients speak, we must feed them with our blood." And that's not a quote from him. It's attributed to Ulrich von Williamwitz, but that is the first time I'd ever seen it or heard it, and so I wanted to mention Williams. But I thought that's kind of the key, I think, to understanding what's going on with Nolan, and then with the reception of Nolan and all these debates about authenticity and casting and stuff like that. And um, making them speak, does require acknowledging that they're ancient, like they're distant from us, but we feed them with our blood, our heart, right? Our perspective. And I think that's what Nolan does. McIntyre, who, I love him. I've studied him since I was, I don't know, how old was I? 20? And now I'm 40. And I feel like I learn new things from him all the time. And reading Whose Justice with Rationality really had opened the door in my mind to thinking about Homer in a different way. And I think maybe that's helpful for thinking about Nolan's Odyssey too. There's this part where he says in Whose Justice with Rationality that each translator cannot but, if he's to be intelligible to his intended audience, blend Homer's idiom with that of his own age. And the better the translator, the more subtly it will be, transmuting Homer's quite alien preconceptions into more familiar ones. This is why each particular culture and cultural milieu needs its own translations of Homer, and it is why the path to understanding Homer is through understanding the specific limitations of each translation as well as its achievements. And here he's talking about actual translations, and he does this really cool thing in this chapter where he compares translations from different periods, and he shows like how their presumptions are reflected and how they translate different parts. But I think we could add this like way of thinking about idioms and moments and eras, uh, to how we're thinking about Nolan. Um, Nolan is making the text intelligible to our age. Um, so, like, what does that mean? Uh, have a very particular idea of what it means, and I'm going to talk about that. That's what I'm kind of wanting to do. Before I do that, though, it's worth pointing out that there have been a lot of translators, like of the poem, and then translators into the idiom and sense of retellers of this story. So you can think of Virgil, um, you can think about Dante, you can think about Tennyson, and they're basically telling the story of the Odyssey, or uh, putting the Odyssey into the text they're presenting us with. And it's a new Odysseus with the concerns of the sort of people of, Virgil, Dante, Tennyson's time, and the perspective and insight. And so all this is to say, this is just a really old tradition, um, to have Nolan give us an Odyssey that isn't going to be without our moments, without our concerns, without what's important for how we live now. I don't understand why it's the conservatives in particular. mean, there's different critiques you can make of the film, but the biggest, loudest ones have been kind of like culture war critiques. Um, really like conservative focused, especially post realignment conservative. Uh, and for the life of me, as someone who, in theory, I hear a lot of conservatives say, especially if they're academics or academically minded, like they'll say, um, we love the canon. We love the Western canon. We need to honor the Western canon. We need to learn from it. We need to teach it. It's been deconstructed, it's been devalued, whatever, right? For the life of me, I cannot understand why, just from the perspective of scholar or teacher or cultural critic, we don't see this moment as a great one. To get like a part of the canon into our students' hands, into the culture's mind again. Isn't this what we've always been waiting for and wanting? And I just like, I had stars in my eyes when I saw how much money this made. I was so excited. And in some ways, this is really frustrating because this brand of conservatism, a friend put it to me this way, in a conversation. It's like there's sore winners and there's sore losers. And they're also the ones who happens to be taking up the mantle of, the canon and of this inheritance. Well, you don't survive if you can't win and you can't lose. Like, if you don't know how to win and you don't know how to lose, well, you're not going to survive. And if you're the one who, for institutional or ideological reasons, is really cultivating this, we're saving the canon, we're saving the West perspective, you know, this bitterness, this anger, this sourness, you're ruining this inheritance. You're blocking people from knowing it again. You are turning people off to it, and really see it as kind of a niche and reactionary space. Um, how are you going to preserve anything if that's how you behave? All of that being said, right? I think I feel like my rant may seem like it's out of place. Maybe it is, but I don't really think so. If we think about these tellings of the Odyssey, these translations of the Odyssey, these new images of the Odyssey, that happen in the canon over and over again, if we see them as a moment for, um, basically an era to sort through its big philosophical concerns and questions and debates, and to have a monocultural moment where everyone can access a text and talk about it and learn from it and also have disagreements, but just a grounded space. You know, this is this is culturally reviving. This is culturally enlivening. And if this bitterness and this pettiness is blocking this moment, we're blocking a source of rejuvenation in a way that, like McIntyre says, we can be renewed. We can have out our existential questions, um, sort through them, reflect on them, express them. So what's happening with Nolan? Um, It's actually a really small C conservative film, like many Nolan films are actually. I know he's not like conservative, but I mean, all his texts end up being this kind of conservative coded uh, problem, which is that he has this question of, what is the responsibility of the virtuous, meaning, the gifted, the excellent, to wield power well? And what happens when the virtuous, the excellent, the gifted don't wield that power well? When they either fail in their responsibility or abandon their responsibility. Um, I think you see this in Oppenheimer. I think you see it really clearly in the Batman films. He's especially interested in the confluence of power and virtue in men, in masculinity, and the way that powerful men um, can leave the vulnerable suffering when they suffer corruption. Now, one of the reasons this is that I say Nolan generally moves in these conservative tones is because he's not saying that there shouldn't be powerful men or that masculinity is a problem. It's the corrupted archetype of the protected patriarch that's the problem, and the implicit solution seems to always point to, um, I guess, some sort of more like healing of that figure, moderation of that figure, um, moderation in the classical sense. I think the Odyssey is, though, the space where he does this the most clearly. Um, but if you look at Oppenheimer, you look at Batman, a lot of that it really is about what happens when these really brilliant, gifted, strong men fail in their responsibility to others, to the world, to their community, and to the people in their lives, like the ones they love. It's also worth mentioning, just about the text of the Odyssey itself, that I kind of think in some of the reception I've read, that there's this idea that Nolan liberalized it or he made it like a really different text than one that is focused on like these. mm, I don't know. In a lot of these circles, you see sort of this bemoaning of a loss of more ancient Western masculine conceptions of virtue and power. Um, and, people who feel that way are going to read the Odyssey as a text that deals in um, those understandings of heroism and power. But the text of the Odyssey, while, that's present in it, it's more complicated than that, too. It's filled with a lot of tensions itself. I kind of have always felt when I read it that it's almost like this is a text that is itself placed in a moment of cultural change or cultural questioning, like a hinge moment. Um, and so a lot of this older warrior king model ethic is there. But you'll also have times like where you have Odysseus weeping over the sacking of Troy, after the Trojan horse trick. And here Homer makes a comparison between the weeping Odysseus uh, reliving what happened in Troy, and the widowed women of Troy. It's 1 to 1. The weeping Odysseus is compared to the women who have lost their husbands and their protectors in this world, their providers in this configuration of society. Um, it's a 1 to 1 comparison for him. And generally speaking, Odysseus himself, he's a trickster. He is crafty, he's wily, he's deceitful. He's not the most physically strong, though he's clearly really physically strong and gifted. But there are others who are more physically strong, more gifted. His skill is his mind, um, and his quick wit. And at the time of the writing, well, I guess maybe not writing, but you know what I mean. Um, at the time, that the Odyssey is contemporary, uh, that audience would associate deceit, trickery. These types of things are womanly things. These are not masculine ways of winning. So and there's already appearances of um that it's not a straight up hero era epic. um there's a reason that Homer says he's a complicated man. What I think ultimately Nolan wants to do with all of this, it's a text that's very rich, tons of cultural valence touchstones. Then of course you're going to have Dante's Odysseus. You're going to have the understanding of Odysseus that comes from Virgil. There's a lot of Odysseus uh, portrayals in um, the literature of the ancient Greeks too. So there's these competing Odysseus's, where Nolan is turning to all of this, I think, and what he's going to pull from all of that and what he's going to contribute to it is really a story. This is just my opinion of the failing father. The father understood as the archetype of the protector provider. Um, Nolan's giving us a story of the failing father who becomes a hero specifically because he goes through this period of Odyssey and he returns as the protector father who sets things right for his wife, his son, his faithful servants, the ones that are faithful, his dog, and his people, his island. How does he fail as a father in the beginning? The father archetype. The clearest example is the central moral example for Nolan, which is with Sinon. Um, Odysseus is clearly a virtuous man at the start of the movie, virtuous in this specific sense of the powerfully excellent or the excellently powerful. We're shown him surrounded by uh, admiring men in a hall with his wife. Its resources are plentiful, and he shows off his mastery with the bow. Um, so you're given this sense of this really virile man who has made this island prosperous, um, and happy. So we have that understanding of virtue, this excellently powerful man. But very quickly, we see what happens with Sinon. And in that moment, we know, okay, this excellently powerful man is corrupt or corrupted. And both of these things can be true at the same time. It's not like one cancels out the other. And in fact, McIntyre thinks that this is the inheritance of Homer, the question that he really presents for the West and that later interlocutors deal with. Um, he points out, McIntyre does, and whose justice and with rationality, that Homer gives us this problem, which is that virtue, it can be understood in different ways. It can be, in both ways, are real. It can be understood as the good of justice, moral righteousness. That's one way of talking about virtue or the virtuous. But virtue can also be understood as the excellently powerful. Virtue can be understood as winning, as victory. Now, Homer, is operating in a culture where those things are conflated, right? This is McIntyre's argument that uh, moral rightness, moral goodness, decay, and victory and power are united. This is what the concept of virtue means. However, in Homer himself, he dramatizes, he problematizes that sort of superficial unity. In fact, goodness, moral goodness, moral rightness, that sense of virtue, and power and prowess and excellence and victory, which lead to victory, right? Um, those are things that can be at odds. They are both a part of the definition of virtue, but they don't always converge. In fact, they often diverge. The obvious example in Homer is Hector, who I love, Prince of Troy, valiant, noble man, uh, gifted and fearless warrior, you know, selfless and brave commander, prince of his city, loving husband, strong father, um, excellent in kind of all the ways a human can be excellent. Uh, there's no way that he's going to be victorious, though. He may be all these other types of virtue, all these other things virtue can mean. Is he going to be able to beat Achilles? No, right? There's no planet on which he beats the more powerful part divine Achilles. Hector, while possessing all of this one conception of virtue, is going to lose. He's a loser. And so, what do you do? That's a divergence of these different aspects of virtue for the Greeks. It's a problem. Um, in Nolan's Odyssey, Agamemnon has chosen between the virtue of goodness, justice, and the virtue of winning and power and victory. And he's chosen the latter sort of emphasis of virtue. Ultimately, of course, sacrificing his daughter in the pursuit of a win. Now, Odysseus tells Penelope early on in the film that he must fight in Agamemnon's war, um, even though she's desperate for him not to. And he says it's a war that's being conducted under a pretense, and it's actually for the sake of trade and regional hegemony. Refusing to fight, he explicitly tells his wife, would mean that Agamemnon would come for his son Telemachus. And obviously, he already, was willing to dispose of his own daughter uh, because of this war. So why would Odysseus' son be off limits? Not long after this, we see Odysseus giving away someone else's son, Sinon, uh, who he sacrifices, not just at the beginning, right? When the lots are switched, but again for the ruse of the Trojan horse. Now, Agamemnon is clearly one kind of bad father archetype. He's clearly one failure, one version of masculine power, sort of abandoning what I think Nolan is saying it should be. He is a man who just grasps after and wants power, and he will sacrifice the vulnerable that he's supposed to protect. But he still wants respect. He still wants obedience. He still wants authority. Um, he shows that vice of pleonexia, of grasping this, and ultimately he cannibalizes his children like Saturn does. Um, and the win that he gets turns out to be a Pyrrhic victory, a civilization ending victory. Odysseus is another kind of failed father archetype. And we see this, like I've pointed to a few times by now in how Nolan uses Sinon. Sinon's been used brilliantly here. People have been focused on all kinds of silly things about that, and it's causing them to miss the point that this is a reflection of Odysseus's excess. The way that he is a bad father archetype is another way of doing this, which is that his sort of hubris, his understanding of the world and his role in the world, and his manipulativeness allow him to feel like he is above owing people straight dealing. Um, he knows better. He knows the way things should turn out. So he knows what risks should be taken, what deceits are permitted in light of his chosen goals, and his chosen goals are right. The critique here is of hubris, and this way of thinking, like Agamemnon's way of thinking, leaves the people he's supposed to protect unprotected and unprovided for. And he ends up sacrificing them too, the way that Agamemnon does. Now, I said earlier that I think Odysseus is this type of the failing father, but sort of going through a purgative journey where he, is able to restore moral order on Ithaca by atoning. Before he gets to that point, though, instead of atonement, he really gets focused on bringing all his men home. And more in the movie, you see him really focused on control. Uh, Control to the point of trying to have control over other people's choices that he can't control. It gets really explicit in a discussion with Athena, where she says, "Is it choice or chance? If all your men don't make it home, if they end up, you know, doing a stupid thing that gets them killed." And Odysseus says, "It's choice, it's choice. It's sort of all in his control." So, on the one hand, you have the Odysseus who abandons his post for moments when he's needed, like in the example I gave with Sinar. If we're thinking about him as a father protector, provider figure. But then you also have him kind of getting so wrapped up in the idea of father, protector, provider, leader, that he is saying that he has control over things, things are his fault. That cannot be. Because his men can choose, they have agency. And in that conversation with Athena, he's really talking about the lives of these other men and what happens to them only in terms of his failure and his power. I think this is really important because it's getting to the core anxiety that is driving these two maladaptive versions of the father. If you're thinking about the Agamemnon version, right, of the sort of overly grasping, um, sort of predatory father, or you're thinking about Odysseus and his compromises with expediency, or with, his use of unsavory means for ends that he thinks are good. Either of those versions of the failing father in this conversation with Athena, I think you could look at this as Nolan sort of saying those maladaptive practices come out of fear. Like, these men have a protector provider role. Uh, and the weight of that, it causes them to be crushed, um, and to cope in these bad ways. Athena's conversation with him shows us that his anxiety, Odysseus's anxiety over his failures, his real failures, and his imagined failures, come from him thinking he has more control that he does, or that his belief that he can only be safe and others can only be safe if he has that level of control. Uh, This is why he doesn't want to go home, actually, because he failed. The divine plays a role in this text. This is another way I think it's really conservative. This Nolan's movie, the divine plays the role of allowing this protector provider figure to face what he has done, and to yield control to the will of the gods. uh, he has to, in a sense, admit or confess, um, and then also realize and accept the limits of his power and submit to a higher power. That's super, that's really traditional. When he comes back, he still uses his wiliness when he's coming back to Ithaca. It's not like, he becomes some person he's never been. What happens is he's still that person, but he's a transformed version of that person. So he is wily, he's clever. He uses a disguise of a beggar to get into his home, and to give himself the level of protection he needs to execute the plan. He has also, his trickiness is happening, but it's happening in a different way because now he is a hero who has learned to subject his excellence to a divine law. Um, this is really a call for moderation. Moderation comes from confessing and facing up to what you've done, and then submitting yourself to a higher order. That's what moderation will do for the leader male the protector provider. He has to submit himself to the divine, um, and admit his oversteps. It's only after he does this that he can become the restorer of civilizational order. Um, and he's able to do that. Finally, it's pretty clear that by being the person who restores that order, he will have to go into exile. Um, but in doing this, he's given his son a great gift because he's given his son a an Ithaca in balance with the will of the gods to rule, uh, for Telemachus to take over in his stead. And he's put his island on the path to healing in unison with decay, in unison with justice, as Homer would have understood it. And, you know, Telemachus has clean hands to be able to be a father protector, provider. And that's kind of a very Batman moment too, 'cause it's like the person who can bring order and harmony to this corrupt place is the person who has to ultimately accept that they have to be out of the community. Um, Odysseus enters into exile, but he'll bury his men. And this is a nice ending for him. I think he's meeting a duty of piety that we saw earlier on in the film. He didn't want to meet. He was like, he blew off when his men died in the cave. He was like, "Oh, we got to go." Like for the sake of expediency, he's going to give up, transgress on these norms of piety of burying your dead. And now, he's going to sail off into exile, and he's going to commit these deeds of piety, and also love his wife and be happy with his wife. It's a good ending. I cannot, I mean, people can have all sorts of reasons that they don't like the film. Um, I don't think that you can say that it isn't a noble effort, uh, or that it doesn't deal with real issues, real problems, real questions that we have now. And I kind of think maybe the reason it's gotten such a bad reception on certain parts of the right is maybe it is striking too close to home. This idea of the patriarch who abandoned his duty and failed and has left all the vulnerable with no protector and is in fact possibly consuming them. Maybe that's too on the nose.